I can still picture that morning when she arrived, soft and almost certain, as if she instinctively knew her place in the world. A light mist hung over the cobblestone streets of our hilltop village, while olive trees in the distance swayed gently, their silver-green leaves rustling like quiet conversations. It was the sound of a faint, deliberate tapping that first caught my attention. When I opened my old wooden door, there she was, a slender, soot-gray cat with fur like smooth velvet and large amber eyes that seemed to watch me closely. She didn't make a sound or flinch. She simply looked and waited, as if she were seeking a home. I paused before stepping out. Standing barefoot on the chilly stone floor of my entryway, I found myself gazing at her. There was something about her presence that felt a bit unsettling, but not in a negative way, just unfamiliar. Unlike the other strays that often roamed by, she didn't seem anxious or demanding. Instead, there was a quiet strength about her, an assurance that made it hard to look away. I finally crouched down, greeting her softly with a "Ciao, Bella," as if I were welcoming an old friend. Her ears perked up. She blinked slowly, then lifted her paw and tapped the threshold again, almost like she was knocking once more. I opened the door wider. She entered with a gentle grace, her paws barely making a sound on the terracotta tiles. The warmth from the fireplace captured her interest right away, and she moved toward it, curling into a tight ball on the corner rug, settling down as if she belonged. I found myself standing there for what felt like ages, observing this stray cat claim a space in my home that I hadn't realized was empty. The hour that followed was filled with silence. I focused on shaping a clay bowl, my hands moving a bit slower than usual while my eyes often wandered to her. Nina, as I decided to name her. She seemed to watch me in return, her eyes half closed, with the tip of her tail flicking gently every now and then. When Marco dropped by later with some leftover bread and raised an eyebrow at the sight of her, I shrugged and said, "She knocked." What was I supposed to do? The next few days turned into a gentle unfolding of everything I thought I knew about being alone. Nina didn't impose. She carried herself with dignity. She ate sparingly, napped by the fire, and followed me from room to room like a quiet companion. Yet there was a story behind her eyes, something unspoken, as if she held more than just hunger within her. On the third night, I found her sitting by the window, gazing into the darkness with her ears perked back, alert and watchful. That was when Milo made his entrance. He was a stark contrast to Nina. I spotted him under the olive tree, a sturdy cat with scruffy fur and a torn ear. He was glaring toward the house, clearly debating whether to stick around or run away. When I opened the door, he didn't approach me. But Nina, always curious, stepped outside without hesitation. There was no fear in her, she merely recognized him. They stood still, exchanging looks without a hiss or a touch. The next morning, Julia arrived with a soft crate and concern in her eyes. "Leonardo, you can't keep them both," she said gently. "You know the routine. They come, you feed them, and then you find them homes." But this felt different. These weren't just any cats, at least not to me. As I started to bond with them, Marco pointed out, "You're getting too involved. They're animals, not house guests." Now Nina had settled in the studio, while Milo kept his distance. Each day I wrestled with the urge to break my own rules about keeping them. Then, one evening, a change in the atmosphere caught my attention. The air turned colder, the breeze rustling through the olive branches, creating a faint sound that made the shutters creak. I was focused on smoothing clay when Nina made an unsettling noise, a low, wavering cry that didn't fit the quiet of the house. When I looked, I found her curled up in a corner, her sides heaving and her body trembling as if she was fighting against something deep inside of her. Fear gripped me like a vase crashing to the floor. I could sense that this was more than mere exhaustion or chill. Without a moment's pause, I called Julia. Within 10 minutes, she arrived, barefoot and out of breath, with a blanket and a look that showed she had faced these situations before. I watched as she examined Nina with care, feeling the tension in the air. Every crack in the old stone walls seemed to amplify the quiet, and the warmth from the fire felt suffocating against the growing worry in my chest. When Julia finally spoke, her tone was steady yet firm. Something was off. It could be neurological, possibly linked to past trauma. Hidden damage, she described, something that often reveals itself only when it's too late. I stood there, clay still coating my hands and a weight heavy in my throat, realizing that Nina hadn't just come to me for shelter. She might have been looking for help that I wasn't equipped to give. The house, once filled with quiet routines and soft colors, now felt delicate. It was as if Nina's sudden collapse had drawn the light from every corner. Julia lingered after the examination, her voice barely a whisper, her forehead creased as she carefully mixed herbs and liquids into an old glass dropper from her coat. She moved like someone accustomed to carrying the weight of others' pain, but somehow managing to keep it from settling deep within herself. That night, Milo drew closer. He stood by the studio door, his eyes shining from the shadows, his body tense but still, almost as if he was keeping watch. It was an unusual change for him, this wild creature becoming so calm, not from fear, but perhaps in recognition of something greater than himself. In contrast, Marco had a different take on the heaviness that seemed to fall over us. He arrived the next morning with his usual loaf of bread and a dose of disapproval. "This isn't your responsibility," he said, not unkindly, but with the familiar firmness he used when he believed my feelings were overtaking my judgment. "You don't even know her story. You don't know what she's carrying." I had no reply, just the image of Nina's small, shaking body nestled beside the warmth of my drying pots, as if she believed the earth could support her. I found myself caught in a mix of emotions, thankful for her trust, yet frightened that I was already failing her. 3 days after Nina's episode, the fragile calm I had held onto began to crack. Word traveled fast. Small towns soak up every detail like clay molds itself to shapes pressed into it. It began with Signora Letty, an older neighbor who stopped me by the well. She asked if I had heard about a disease affecting the stray animals near the orchards. Her tone made it sound casual, but the warning stuck in my mind. Later that evening, I received an unexpected call from Luca, the local vet. His tone was low and careful, like people talk when they have news you might not want to hear. He mentioned there had been cases, neurological issues, progressive symptoms, likely viral. He asked if he could come to see Nina personally. As I waited for Luca to arrive the following morning, I noticed Milo was gone. One moment, he was perched on a wall near the potted rosemary, watching the door with unwavering loyalty. The next, he had vanished. I walked for hours along the gravel path by the orchard, calling out softly, even though I knew I wouldn't get a response. It felt pointless, like trying to catch smoke with my bare hands. Yet Nina refused to eat. Julia suggested taking her to the clinic, but I could see the worry etched across her face. A clinic could mean quarantine, separation, or an end I wasn't ready to face. What had started as a small act of kindness was evolving into something much more serious, with consequences none of us had foreseen. That night, I stood at the studio's doorway, arms crossed, feeling the silence weigh down on me like the damp wind that curled in from the hills. Nina was nestled in a worn blanket, her eyes half closed and her breaths deep but shallow. I watched her chest rise and fall, each breath almost a quiet statement from a world I didn't fully grasp. There was a feeling inside me that was hard to put into words, not simply pity or care, but something deeper. She had claimed this space and me without my realizing it. I wasn't sure anymore whether I had saved her or she had saved me. Julia said we needed to make a decision soon, whether to take her in for good, isolate her, or prepare for the possibility of losing her. The thought of returning her to a cage, especially after she had chosen this place with such poise, felt fundamentally wrong. There was an unexplainable sense of betrayal wrapped up in it. Was I willing to give up parts of my life for an animal I hardly knew, simply because she had shown up at my door when I needed her? Or was it fear of what her departure would take from me? That evening, a storm rolled in suddenly. Thunder rumbled low over the rooftops, the sky darkening with deep purple and gloomy gray, and the scent of rain filled the air. The house creaked as the wind whipped through, shutters banging like old bones. In the midst of it all, I realized Nina was no longer by the hearth. I called out her name instinctively, my voice cutting through the rising sound of rain, and a wave of fear rushed through me as I checked every empty corner. Eventually, I found her crouched by the door, her ears pinned back and her body tense, staring not at me but at something beyond the glass. And there he was, Milo. soaked to the skin, sitting on the stone ledge like a shadow returning home. But something about him had changed. His eyes were wide, wild, and unfocused. He stayed still as I got closer. I noticed his body was shaking, and his breathing was quick and uneven. That's when I spotted the little scratches on his nose, one paw raised off the ground, and his fur was caked with something darker than mud. It was clear that something more than just the storm had frightened him. Something had happened out there. Luca's words echoed in my mind, neurological signs and behavioral changes. A chill ran down my spine as I carefully wrapped Milo in a blanket. He felt limp, but his eyes were wide and darting around. I glanced at Nina, who hadn't moved. Her eyes were fixed on him, as if she understood something that I couldn't see. I had brought them both into my home, but was I inviting danger inside as well? The days that followed seemed to drag on, heavy with an unspoken tension. Milo stayed indoors now, but he had lost his usual confident demeanor. He wandered through the rooms like a shadow in a place that felt foreign, flinching at loud sounds and vanishing for hours into the darkest corners. Though his injury was minor, it seemed to hint at something more troubling beneath the surface. He would twitch in his sleep, hiss unexpectedly when touched, and stare at nothing for long periods, his pupils dilated like dark valleys. Julia came by each afternoon to check on him, her tone growing more cautious and her silences stretching longer. There was no clear diagnosis, but an air of uncertainty surrounded us, much like the storm clouds that lingered since that night. Nina, on the other hand, was completely different. She became more alert and watchful. She trailed after Milo, not too close, not openly, but always nearby as if connected to his unease. At night, I would find her sitting by his corner, eyes wide open, almost like she sensed his struggles before they occurred. There was a strange bond forming between them, one that I didn't fully grasp. It felt as though something deep and instinctual had passed between them during their time apart, something I couldn't share in. For the first time, I started to feel like a stranger in my own home. Marco's visits became shorter and more charged, his patience wearing thin with each new development. "You're letting this go too far," he said one evening, pacing the kitchen with his coat still on. "They're not your family. They're strays. You don't even know what they're bringing with them." But deep down, I understood. They were carrying everything I had kept hidden for so long. Loneliness, silence, need. I found myself unsure if I was ready to let go. Inside the house, the atmosphere had grown noticeably heavier, not due to the weather, but from unspoken words. Julia had begun giving suggestions, phrases like, "You might want to think about," or "It might be best to." Meanwhile, Marco had stopped asking questions altogether. He visited less often, staying just long enough to take in the room, like someone assessing the aftermath of a slow disaster. I could sense the question lingering in his gaze. "What are you really doing here, Leo?" The answer slipped away from me, leaving me unable to respond. Then Luca came over. His face looked worn, and he walked with purpose. He carried a small black case and spoke in a low voice. Sitting at the kitchen table, he opened a folder full of notes and explained that while Milo's behavior wasn't a definite diagnosis, it was a sign of something spreading in the area, probably a virus that might not be curable. He suggested that quarantine would be the best approach, but also hinted that we might need to think about prevention. It took me a bit to grasp his meaning, and when I finally did, my stomach knotted. He asked if I was ready to take that step. I didn't reply. Instead, I looked at Nina, who was curled up by the fireplace, her body relaxed but her eyes wide awake. Then I glanced at Milo, huddled by the cellar steps, a mix of wildness and exhaustion. The tension in the room was palpable. They were here because I had let them in. Now I faced the difficult choice of whether to save them or to protect everything else by letting them go. Yet nothing within me could distinguish between the two anymore. The days that followed blended together in a kind of aimless waiting. It felt as if the whole house was holding its breath. I stopped working. The kiln sat cold, the clay dried out on the wheel. I often found myself lost in thought, staring at the walls, noticing flickers of movement, and watching Nina's back as she slept, always positioned between me and the door, like a silent question that I didn't know how to answer. Milo rarely ventured into the light. His eyes, however, were always visible, glowing from under the furniture, peeking from behind the stairs, and lurking in the shadowy corner by the radiator where the light failed to reach. Each twitch of his ears made me tense. Every quiet hour without an outburst felt like a fleeting moment of respite. Julia began to push me more now, although with a gentle approach. She brought pamphlets, rehoming centers, mobile care units, and a contact in Florence who might take in aggressive strays. Her eyes were gentle, but her words were firm. "If you keep them both," she said carefully, "you might lose more than you realize." I didn't mention that I already felt that loss. Marco came over, even though he hadn't been invited. He took a stance in the middle of the kitchen, arms crossed as if he were bracing for something unexpected. "You can't keep risking everything for a feeling," he said. "They're not your children. This isn't your fight." What neither of them realized was that logic had slipped away weeks ago. This wasn't just about concerns for safety or the well-being of my home. It was about the deeper meaning of choice, holding on even when there's no promise of a reward or assurance of peace. This wasn't simply a decision between cats and comfort anymore. It was a choice between the life I had carefully built to keep others away and the life that had quietly taken root within that space. That night, sleep eluded me. The fire had extinguished itself, and I didn't bother to reignite it. I settled into the armchair by the window, a blanket draped over my shoulders, my gaze drifting not to the stars beyond the hills, but to the dark corners of my own home. Nina lay at my feet, not curled up as usual, but stretched out and alert, fixed on the cellar door. I could hear Milo moving behind it, soft scuffs and a low growl that ebbed and flowed like distant thunder beneath the floorboards. He hadn't eaten in 2 days. His body was failing him, and something in his mind had ventured too far to return. The next morning, I called Luca. I told him he needed to come. My voice remained steady, but inside me, I felt like I was unraveling, each thread of my resolve straining under the weight of what lay ahead. Julia arrived shortly after, without needing an invitation, bringing a carrier and a small black box I struggled to face. Marco showed up last, lingering at the doorway, looking like he wanted to respect the situation, but couldn't look away. We opened the cellar carefully. Milo didn't bolt. He emerged quietly, head low, eyes dull, showing no fight left in him. As I reached out, he leaned his head against my palm, not out of affection, but in recognition, as if he understood. Nina sat a few feet away, still and tense. Her gaze never left his. For a moment it felt like something sacred passed between them. Grief, perhaps, or forgiveness. I had brought both of them into this house. Now I needed to decide who would leave it with me. And I found myself unsure whether I was strong enough to live with either choice. The morning air felt unusually still, as if the world was holding its breath. There were no birds chirping, no leaves rustling in the olive trees outside, just a soft, steady hum that hinted at change on the horizon. It reminded me of that quiet moment before a funeral, where even the walls seemed to absorb the weight of sorrow. I woke up before sunrise, not out of necessity, but because sleep had slipped away. I found myself simply observing Nina curled by the hearth and Milo resting in the shadows of the cellar. They both seemed so still, as if they sensed the shift in time, as if they recognized the heavy decision we were facing. When Luca arrived, I didn't say a word. I just opened the door. His expression was serious, yet gentle, his hands buried deep in his coat pockets, as if he were afraid they would shake. Shortly after, Julia came in. Her face revealed little, but she emanated a calm presence, as if she were here to share the emotional load with me. Marco came next, stepping inside without knocking, moving back and forth at the door like he wasn't quite sure he should be there in this moment of sadness. I moved at a measured pace, not from reluctance but out of respect. Each movement felt significant. I took the thin fleece blanket from the studio chair, the one Milo had used during better days, and wrapped it around him. He didn't put up any resistance. His body, still warm, seemed to release its grip on instinct, a quiet letting go that I could feel in the space between us. As I held him close, I found myself whispering something I hadn't even known I needed to express. "You were never a burden." Perhaps I said it for him, or maybe for me, or maybe it was something I needed to accept. Nina followed me to the door, moving with the same quiet grace she had shown on her first day. She didn't cry or reach out, but she paused beside the carrier, gazing down at Milo. When she looked up at me, her expression was a mixture of sadness and understanding, a connection that struck me deeply. I placed Milo inside the carrier, adjusting the blanket around him one last time before securing the latch with hands that felt weary and worn. Luca met my gaze, offered a small nod, and turned towards his truck. I couldn't bring myself to watch it pull away. I just couldn't. Nina stayed by the open doorway for a while after he left, her figure outlined against the soft winter light, as if she were keeping watch over the space he had occupied. I sat next to her, and we both shared a moment of silence, pondering whether letting go was an act of love or something else entirely. The house feels quieter now, though it isn't empty. The silence has shifted. It's less about absence and more about a gentle respect. Milo's corner remains just as he left it, with a soft blanket folded neatly, as if he might return one day. I haven't touched it. I can't bring myself to. Nina often glances at that spot, but it's not with longing. Instead, it's a stillness that acknowledges a memory we both hold dear. Life has settled back into a familiar pace, filled with the rhythm of clay on the wheel, the soft scratch of a brush against drying glaze, and the calming sound of the kettle in the quiet mornings. Yet something within me has changed. There's a newfound softness in how I view things, an openness to feeling emotions that I once tucked away beneath the busyness of daily life. Nina doesn't venture out much these days, choosing to stay where the morning sun hits the window, beside me in the studio, or curled up next to me at night. Her presence has mellowed. She is less watchful and more relaxed, but I know she still holds the echoes of our shared experiences. Julia comes by often, while Marco, still a bit hesitant, now lingers longer, sometimes sticking around for coffee and asking about Nina, in a way that suggests he cares, even if he doesn't say it outright. What lies ahead remains uncertain. I'm not sure how long Nina will be with me, or if another stray will find their way to my door again. But I do know this: if they do, I'll be ready to welcome them. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever opened your heart or your home to something unexpected, then you understand the beauty and weight of choosing love, even in uncertainty. These moments, much like Nina's arrival, come softly. Often, the decision to welcome them can transform everything, not just for them, but for us as well. If you've had a similar experience, or if you believe in the quiet strength of kindness, I invite you to share your story in the comments. Let's create a space where those experiences are valued. If you're interested in more stories like this, tales of second chances, surprising connections, and the complex, inspiring journey of rescue, consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you stay updated on what's next. It's fascinating to think about who might be waiting just outside your door.